This is the Whole Care Network. Helping you tell your story one podcast at a time. Content presented in the following podcast is for information purposes only. Views and opinions expressed in this podcast are solely those of the host and guest and may not represent the views and opinions of the Whole Care Network. Always consult with your physician for any medical advice, and always consult with your attorney for any legal advice. And thank you for listening to the Whole Care Network.
As caregivers, we are the experts on our loved ones. No doctor, no nurse, nobody's going to come in and be a better expert than we are about them. But having another viewpoint, another perspective, some additional information, all those things can be really, really helpful. And I felt like our hospice workers were really good at being respectful of us as family members and caregivers in that way.
This is the Heart of Hospice podcast with Helen Bauer. I'm talking with author and caregiver Amy Goyer of AARP today. Whether you're a family caregiver or an end-of-life professional, the Heart of Hospice is here to enhance your hospice experience by connecting you with information you can use about end-of-life care.
The sponsor for this episode of The Heart of Hospice is National HME. National HME is a direct service hospice durable medical equipment company. Using their proprietary software, Hospice Cloud Pro, providers can enter new patient information, order equipment, arrange pickups, and obtain real-time reporting, including order status and much more. National HME excels at providing service with care and empathy. To learn more, visit nationalhme.com. Today's episode is sponsored by Odonata Care. Odonata's motto is, "Care is treatment." They have a mission to transform the end-of-life experience for the patient and caregivers through education and support. Odonata Care is revolutionizing the hospice experience with their booklet, The Care Plan, A Path to Comfort for the Hospice Patient, along with 50 free YouTube videos that teach the basics of bedside care. Visit thecareplan.net for more information. Now, here's today's episode.
Oh man, my guest today, Amy Goyer. She's an author, a speaker, a consultant who specializes in aging in families, including caregiving, grandparenting, and multi-generational issues. And this is what I'm going to say about Amy Goyer. She knows a few things because she's seen a few things. She's seen more than a few things. She's seen a lot. Amy is the author of numerous publications, including AARP's Juggling Work and Caregiving and Things to Do Now That You're a Grandparent. She's been an advocate for older adults and children and families for more than 30 years at the local, state, national, and international levels. She started her career as a music therapist and an adult day service administrator, and later on she worked at the Ohio Department of Aging before she joined AARP. She's been with AARP for 15 years, and she leads the intergenerational and grandparenting programs, in addition to a lot of other stuff she does surrounding caregiving, and she will be telling you about what she's doing at AARP. You're going to love this. It's a lot of information, a lot of wisdom and experience compacted into one interview. We probably could have made it 2 episodes, but she's sharing this intense caregiving experience that she's had since her 20s, and you're going to hear the good, the bad, and the ugly of everything she did as a caregiver and how it went for her. So here's my conversation with Amy Goyer. Amy, welcome to the Heart of Hospice podcast. It's so great to have you on the show.
Thank you. It's really great to be here with you.
So you have a big event coming up. You were telling me off mic, you're moving.
Yes, my boyfriend and I have been renovating a house that he bought in 2018. We have been working on this house ever since.
Oh, wow.
we broke ground for the addition in November during the pandemic. So it has been the absolute worst time to renovate a house. But I'm doing it all. I've designed it all for aging in place. And my boyfriend is retired, so he's done a lot of the work himself. So it's taken longer. It's not completely finished, sometimes that's how these things are. But we're moving out of my little place that I've rented for 30 years and moving into that house, ready or not.
That's awesome. I mean, that's a huge life change. 30 years in one place.
It is. And of course, I was in Arizona for a huge chunk of those years, but still coming back here, on a regular basis. So it was still my home.
Right. Well, that's incredible. I think it takes a lot of courage to make a life change like that. So the time that you spent in Arizona was related to your caregiving story, wasn't it?
Yes.
Yeah, that's where we're headed. So share your story. I know it's got a lot of layers, but give us the highlights, the 10,000-foot view of your caregiving story.
I got a few hours.
Yeah.
Well, I first became a caregiver when I was in my 20s. I was still in college because my parents, I grew up in Ohio and Indiana, and I was going to college in Ohio to Ohio University, where my dad was a professor. And my parents moved to Arizona for my dad to teach at Arizona State University. So really far away. And my grandparents were aging. I was a sophomore in college. I had just finished my sophomore year when my parents moved. And my dad was an only child. And my grandmother, his mother, had Alzheimer's disease. And his father, my granddaddy, CV, was her caregiver. He was 10 years older than she. And, that was in the early 1980s, and not as much support was in place for caregiving, especially not dementia caregiving. So I took on a role of driving over, checking on them. I was working on my degree in music therapy. So I had already started doing field work and work with older adults. I eventually graduated from college and got a job in Columbus, Ohio, where I worked in adult daycare centers and nursing homes for about 6 years. And then I worked for the Ohio Department of Aging. So I was the kid working in the aging network. I was part of, I was living this all day long. And then, so I knew more from my grandparents and tried to help them and got Meals on Wheels for them and taught my grandfather how to deal with my grandmother's incontinence. And, we eventually had home health providers for them. They eventually had 24-hour care at home because granddaddy started needing more help too. And meanwhile, dad's in Arizona trying to help, manage the finances, coming for visits as frequently as he can. And in the middle of that, my mom had a stroke, and she was 63. And she had, a major stroke. She thankfully was not paralyzed, but she had pain on her right side, chronic pain the rest of her life. And she had aphasia, couldn't communicate, and had a lot of apraxia and things that kept her. She couldn't drive. She couldn't, cooking was really hard. She could heat things up, but doing things sequentially was hard for her. And so dad became not only his parents' caregiver, but mom's primary caregiver. And my sisters and I'm the youngest of 4 girls, and my sisters and I would go out and try to help and take care, and, juggling the grandparents and my other grandmother too, my mom's mom. So that was a lot at a pretty young age. But that changed over time. And my role with my grandparents was different than my role with my mom, or, it's different. Everyone that you're taking care of, your caregiving role is different. But I learned a lot through all those experiences. And eventually I moved to Washington, D.C. and worked for AARP full time. And my dad, was also aging. And eventually he did retire. He had a hip replacement, and I went out and telecommuted for a month and helped them then. So, again, a different caregiving role. And that was a temporary one, really. But over the years with my mom, of course, her health began to fail and needed more help. And so there was just always some type of caregiving role in my life. And then my dad started showing signs of some cognitive impairments. And it turned out he had Alzheimer's also, like his mother had. And that was really diagnosed very early. And so he was still driving and still managing things and doing pretty well, but needed help with complicated stuff, like helping him get organized to refinance the house or get ready for taxes, and financial stuff and paperwork was where it really showed up first. And he also had glaucoma, so his vision was getting impaired. And later we found out the Alzheimer's was actually causing some of his visual processing impairment. So when we wanted him to stop driving, that was a big change. They were needing more and more support. I'm in Washington, D.C., they're in Arizona. And I had one sister who lived there, but she had a daughter with special needs. It was really hard for her. And so long story short, I quit my job so I could be a consultant and have more flexibility. And I started going out to Arizona and working there for a week or two a month. And what happened was I started seeing more changes more rapidly. They weren't eating well because Dad had become the cook after Mom's stroke. And you know how that is. So I finally just said, you know what, Dad, we wanted Dad to stop driving. He said, then we're going to move into a senior community. I don't want us to be stuck in the house. And I said, okay. And I went through all that involved in finding a place for them to live. And I ended up moving out there and moving into their house, which was just 2 miles from where they moved in the senior community. And kept my place in DC to go back for work, periodically. And so at that point I had my place in DC. I had their house that I had moved into, their apartment, because at this point, I was really managing that stuff for them. And they still owned a farm in Ohio where my sister and her kids were living. And so I, really was trying to manage all of these things and get them to all their doctor's appointments and manage their chronic health care. And, they developed various other health issues along the way. It was a lot. And after 3 years in the senior community, we eventually sold their property in Ohio and started getting veterans benefits for my dad. And that was huge because he couldn't have that extra property. And that was very emotional and difficult to do. But then Mom had a catastrophic fall and fractured her spine in 2 places and couldn't walk and had to have surgery. And then in the hospital, she got C. diff and had a heart attack and developed congestive heart failure and had developed atrial fibrillation. And she was septic, everything. But she got through it and went back to rehab. And she was there on the same community where their apartment was, so Dad could walk over every day. He had a service dog who made sure he got everywhere safely. And after, a terrible ordeal, she was in hospitals for 40 days. And I was with her every day and night, and I think my sister relieved me maybe 5 nights of that. And I'm working full time the whole time. Caregivers have a lot of work issues. So she ended up moving back to their apartment. But by this time, Dad was deteriorating also. And I was trying to pay for care for them. Because I had to work, and it just all became too expensive. And so they moved back in the house with me so I could provide more of their care. Because at this point, Dad couldn't be alone. Mom couldn't be alone. And so it was very daunting. And stop me. I'm just rattling on. Is that okay?
That's perfect. I mean, there's so many caregiving issues to unwrap.
That pop up. And that's why, I tell the story because people may not have every issue I had, but they have many of them,
Right. You had all the things.
I just had everything happen. And they moving back in with me, living with someone you're caring for is a whole different experience. And it's very intense, but it's also extremely, there's a lot of quality in there because I had a lot more quality time with them. I could have dinner with them every night at home. I could be taking care of them and still doing my laundry. The thing for me was I had been working at home, and so I had to rent an office. So it became more expensive for me. It relieved my parents' finances and their budget. Basically, I paid for a live-in caregiver who helped during the day. And their budget basically covered that, and I paid for everything else, and rented an office and kept all that going. But they both had long-term care insurance, and they had Dad had veterans benefits by this time. It was a year after we applied that he got his veterans aid and attendance benefits. So we were making it. And Dad had a big hospitalization as well before they moved, and ended up with a feeding tube for 2 months till he had throat surgery. So we had just a lot of hospitalizations and things. So for that first year, we didn't have any hospitalizations, and it was good. It was actually less stressful for me because I had control over the caregivers. I hired them, I trained them. I prepared the food. I had seen them every day anyway, but it was just different. I was able to take care of them better. And a year after they moved in with me, my mom passed away very suddenly from a UTI infection that went septic very fast. And that was really horrible and very hard for all of us, but especially for Dad, because she was kind of his North Star, and she kept him, as long as Mom was around, Dad was happy. He was fine. He may not understand what's going on, but he was fine because Mom was there. So that he grieved, and he was still with it enough that he would get up in the morning and say, "Where's Patricia?" And we'd have to explain, remember she passed away. And then eventually, repeating it every day, he would say, "Oh, yes, I remember now. She passed." And then sometimes he would catch himself as he started to look for her and say, "She's gone." And he would cry. And it was very, very heartbreaking and really hard. And we missed her so much too, And by this time, one of my sisters, the sister that had been in Ohio, moved out to help take care of my parents. So she was I paid her as one of his caregivers for Daddy. I'm sorry, she moved out after Mom passed away. And, we just kept doing the best we could for Pop. And he lived with me for a total of 6 years. And as his dementia progressed, we dealt with other health issues. He developed congestive heart failure eventually, was on oxygen. I did everything I possibly could for him. He got massage once a week. He got someone who came and exercised with him in the pool. And I would get in and help. And that got me exercising too, because caregivers, we don't take care of ourselves. And I knew that was a good way for me to get some exercise too. He had acupuncture, which really helped with the anxieties, and Chinese herbs, and lots of exercise. And he had his service dog. His service dog passed away a year before Daddy passed in 2018. And he died in his sleep at home at night. We had called our other sister, and she came and was there. And what I didn't mention actually is a year after Mom passed, my oldest sister, who I'd also been caregiving for throughout this time, she lived in Maryland, on the eastern shore of Maryland, and she had Cushing disease. And she had been doing better, had been on a new medication, but she had 2 surgeries to try and remove a tumor from her pituitary gland, and I would be there for that. I was her power of attorney and executor of her estate. And she passed away very suddenly a year after my mom did. And the year before my mom died, we lost my niece to suicide. So we had lost 3 beloved family members 3 years in a row. And that was just incredibly hard, but at that time I still had Dad to focus on. So when Daddy passed, it really hit me much harder than I would have anticipated. There's so much grief involved in caregiving, and a lot of times we postpone the grief. We don't fully grieve things, and the loss of all these family members. I had kind of it caught up with me, and I had some health issues and some things I had to take care of. But we did have hospice at the end for my dad for the last 4 months of his life, and that was a big help. I don't know if I assume you want to talk about hospice.
Sure. I would love to hear the good and the bad, Amy. Whatever your experience was, our listeners learned from both sides.
Okay. Yeah. With hospice, I was aware that one of the things that happens is people put off getting help from hospice because the last minute when it could have been helpful for months before that. And so I was cognizant of that. And when his doctor said, I think he qualifies for hospice, I was like, okay, that'll be more help. I really did not believe that he had less than 6 months to live. But I thought that's okay. It'll be more help, and we can always use more help. By that time, he had been seeing doctors from the VA. We had home-based primary care from the VA, which was a game changer for us. I had used a lot of mobile doctors and mobile labs and mobile x-rays and things like that for both my parents, but the home-based primary care with the VA included a nurse practitioner and a nurse case manager, and they had social worker and everybody who came to the house, and they were so fantastic. And that nurse practitioner had said, I think he qualifies for hospice, and the VA set up the hospice. And we had VA home health providers coming every morning to help us get Dad out of bed and get him bathed and dressed and everything. So then hospice took over 3 days a week of that, and they came the other days. And he went into hospice with congestive heart failure as his diagnosis, not the Alzheimer's. And that was partly because, the congestive heart failure we knew was what was probably in the end going to, take him. But also because I did not want to stop him taking his medication he took for the Alzheimer's. He took Aricept, and the generic did not do anything for him, but the brand name did. So I paid extra to cover that. And I had tried twice over the years taking him off of it and saw a big downhill slide. So I was dedicated, and his neurologist had said, I keep people on it now until the end. And it may mean that they can get out of a chair or not, even if it's that basic. Right. And so I wanted to keep him on that. And if he had gone on hospice for Alzheimer's, we would have had to take him off the medication, which didn't even make sense to me, but that's the rule. So he was on for congestive heart failure. And the hospice was great in terms of the social worker was wonderful, and she would check in on my sister and myself. And, it wasn't a game changer for us, I wouldn't say, because we already had different help going on, and because of my professional experience in managing things and stuff, we knew the lay of the land. And, I'd done probably more than your average caregiver, but what was so wonderful, especially, was just being able to call 24/7 and say, this is happening. What does this mean? That type of thing. I remember one night my sister and I are like, is Daddy dying? What's happening? And calling the nurse, and they sent somebody out, and she, said, I don't think he's on the verge right now. And here's what you can expect when he does, is dying, and just talk to us in plain, simple terms about exactly what to expect. And, I had been with both my mom and my sister, but it was different with them. So that was really helpful, being able to talk those things over with them. The social worker and I had started talking about after Daddy dies, because my parents both wanted to donate their bodies to science. And they had set up plans with the University of Arizona. And then when I checked with them, they were not doing that program anymore. And when Mom passed, they were doing something, but they wouldn't accept her because she had been septic. So the social worker at the hospital had helped me find another program that would accept her remains, and that was actually a good experience. They were very sensitive and got her cremated remains back, and they told us which studies she had contributed to, and that was really important to both my parents. And so that really had been a pretty good experience. So I did the same thing with my sister. And then when Daddy passed, I had wanted to try and do the brain bank because he had Alzheimer's. And the social worker had talked with me about that, but we hadn't gotten far enough in the process when he did pass, because like I told you, I didn't really think he was going to die that soon. So we ended up using the same organization that we used for my mom. But she came to the house and walked me through that. I mean, we were falling apart because my dad had died in his sleep, but she helped me, deal with the logistics of it, and that alone. And that is one of the reasons I wanted to make sure and have hospice, because when someone dies at home, it's like, what do you do? It's, if you're in the hospital, there's people there to help you. But I wanted to make sure, it was handled. And so the social worker making those phone calls, doing that stuff, helping me stay focused, was really, really helpful. And we had a wonderful chaplain who came. Turned out he was from Indiana, where my dad was born and raised, and where I was born, and he was Presbyterian, and my dad we were Presbyterian, and so it was just a really good connection, and he was very comforting and understanding, and my sisters and I really needed that right then, especially because now I'm going to cry.
That's okay. We do that too.
Dad was that guy for us, and now he was gone. So it was really nice to have just a strong person there, a comforting person. Yeah.
No, the best interviews, the best conversations are where the tears flow. I love it. I love it that still moves you, that experience still moves you. So, Amy, I mean, there's more content than we could possibly talk about. There's so many wonderful lessons. No, not at all. In your experience, it's so great. There were a couple of things that jump out at me. As a caregiver, you were a live-in caregiver, you were a hands-on caregiver, and then sometimes you went back and forth between doing that and being a remote caregiver.
Exactly.
I don't think I've ever talked about that on the show. We talk about remote caregiving all the time, right? Because that's a very common thing in today's age. People move away. You don't necessarily live your entire life in the same city where you were born and your parents are still there. So there's this distance that we create with the technology and the ease of travel these days. And I think remote caregiving in and of itself has its own challenges, right? Because we know hands-on live-in caregiving, that's brutal. That is brutal, right? When you are around the clock caregiver, and I think it's 63% of caregivers actually work outside the home in addition to being a caregiver at night or in the evenings and weekends. So we know that's hard, but remote caregiving is a challenge as well. That distance creates this, I don't know how I would say it, a blind spot where you want to lay eyes on mom and dad. Is mom losing weight? What does her skin look like? Is dad really providing all that? And I'm a remote caregiver for my own mom. So I've experienced some of that, but fortunately my siblings are close by. So between the three of us, we make this, we triple team my mom is what it comes down to, because my mom is a handful. But for you to move through all these caregiving experiences, and then that last one that struck you so heavily, I'm so glad you had hospice there. Because you got this cumulative grief. And it wasn't just where you were caregiving. I mean, losing your niece to suicide. And these deaths were sudden. So for you to allow hospice to come in, to be open to that experience and to that support, not even sure that your dad was going to have that much time. You know, you really didn't think he had a limited life expectancy of only 6 months. And then they were there when you needed it.
Yeah, absolutely. They were there. And, you talk about long distance caregiving and versus live-in caregiving and remote. And, I've done it all. And I think, the thing about hospice is you got that other outside opinion helping you.
Right.
As caregivers, we are the experts on our loved ones. No doctor, no nurse, nobody's going to come in and be a better expert than we are.
That's true.
About them. But having another viewpoint, another perspective, some additional information, all those things can be really, really helpful. And I felt like our hospice workers were really good at being respectful of us as family members and caregivers, in that way. They didn't try and come and tell us everything what to do type thing,
Right.
but they were very supportive. And I think that's one of the nice things with hospice is that they take into account supporting the caregiver, not just the care for their loved ones. And, many caregivers have had no one doing that, no one looking out for them for years and years and years. So when hospice comes in and they actually care about the caregiver, then it's life-changing for them. And I think that's a huge piece of it.
The sponsor for this episode of The Heart of Hospice is Odonata Care. Odonata Care founders Nancy Hireman and Brenda Goyer are certified hospice and palliative nurses with over 40 years combined experience. They are experts in end-of-life care. Nancy and Brenda have created a 32-page booklet called The Care Plan, A Path to Comfort for the Hospice Patient. Their goal is to empower patients and their caregivers with valuable information right at their fingertips, wherever and whenever they need it. Odonata Care also offers a suite of 50 free training videos on YouTube that teaches the basics of bedside care for personal and professional caregivers. Nancy and Brenda have a mission to transform the end-of-life experience through education and support. That's why Odonata Care's motto is, "Care is Treatment." You can purchase copies of the Care Plan for yourself or your hospice agency at thecareplan.net. A new Spanish edition is also available for purchase on their website in either print or digital versions. The sponsor for this episode of The Heart of Hospice is National HME. National HME is a direct service hospice durable medical equipment company that's serious about providing excellent service through communication and coordination for providers and families. They aim to be an extension of the hospice care team and to make DME the easiest part of the hospice provider's day. Using their proprietary software, Hospice Cloud Pro, providers can enter new patient information, order equipment, arrange pickups, and obtain real-time reporting on their order status, plus much more. National HME also provides text message notifications which keep everyone up to date on when the equipment will be delivered. National understands how important communication is when it comes to every aspect of a hospice patient's care. Here's Chris Maglioka, Senior Vice President of Business Development, describing how National HME technicians stay connected with patients and families.
The family will know through text messaging when the technician's on their way. They'll actually know the technician's name. So, we get the order, our call center calls that patient's family and lets them know, we received the order from the hospice, we'll be out there this afternoon. The technician will contact you with an ETA. And then again, they're going to get that next phone call plus a text message from the technician introducing themselves, letting them know who they are, and then with their ETA. It all starts and ends with the communication part.
National HME does more than just provide equipment. They provide service with care and empathy. To learn more about the services provided by National HME, you can visit their website at nationalhme.com.
You talk about remote caregiving, long distance caregiving in some ways is even harder. It's hard to compare, hands-on live-in caregiving is very intense, but being at a distance has different challenges, and having someone who's your eyes and ears on the ground is super important. So I always had, with my grandparents, we had paid caregivers. My dad's cousins would periodically try to go and check on them. That was one of our big deficits, was not really having somebody there who we felt would be checking it. Is the home health aide really doing what they're supposed to be doing? And we didn't have technology then. We didn't have video chats or anything.
Right.
So that meant a lot of 6.5-hour drives for me and flights for my dad, which is expensive. Long distance caregivers tend to spend more money than other caregivers. AARP's cost of caring study found that caregivers spend on an average about $7,000 a year, or 26% of their income. But long distance caregivers spend even more. And if you're caring for someone with dementia, you spend even more. And that whole thing of being at a distance and not, like you say, the blind spot. That's a good way to describe it. It's like, I know so much, but I don't know if I know everything. And one of the things I did with my parents, because I was traveling and doing various, going back and forth, was I had a geriatric care manager on call, who had met my parents. I made sure she had their up-to-date medical history and their medication lists and their list of doctors. And if something happened and I was at a distance and it took me, one of them had to go in the hospital and it took me a day to fly in or whatever, even hours, she could jump in. And that gave me so much peace of mind. I never had to use her that way. But I knew I could, and that was huge for me. I had other people checking on him, though. I had my friend Debbie, who is a concierge, and she became a very close family friend. She had a concierge business, which they do just a little bit of everything. And I contacted her first because I needed her to check on my house when I was away and check on my parents. And they were still more high functioning and everything then, but I just, like you say, I could tell when mom was developing a UTI, or I could tell when something was off, somebody, you needed to see him. And so she would check in on them, and she was lots of fun and would bring lots of light and joy and laughter to them, which was great. And she also did dog sitting for the dog when we needed her to. And she and her husband would go for walks with my dad. And, so they became a big support. And I knew I could rely on them when I was away too. I could call on them at any time. And then my sister, who lived there, also, had a certain amount of that role. But as I said, she had a lot of the responsibility and stress, and with her daughter who had bipolar disorder. And so, but, she could do some. And so, you have to have a team. I also had neighbors on both sides who I could call on, who knew my parents, that had been my parents' neighbors before I moved in the house. So having that kind of team of eyes and ears on the ground when you're a long distance caregiver is really crucial.
I think we don't realize, everybody always says, it takes a village to raise a child. Yeah, we got the village. There are schools, there are daycares, there are all sorts of programs and support. I think it takes a village to care for someone as they age. And that whole caregiving concierge thing, everybody needs one of those. That's awesome.
I know. And she was even a caregiving concierge. She was just a concierge, but she had never really thought about the caregiving aspects of that. She did everything from dog sitting to, checking people's houses who were snowbirds and, that type of stuff. She would clean out closets for me. She would help me put out holiday decorations. When you think about, is that a high priority? Well, it was, because caregiving isn't just about doctor appointments. It's about quality of life.
Right.
And taking care of yourself as you're caregiving. And especially for mom and me, having the holiday decorations out was big. It filled us up, made us happy. And so she would help with something like that I just didn't have time for. And you can find people in different ways. You might find a caregiving person. You might find a care manager or a geriatric care manager, an aging life care expert is the name of their association. You might find somebody who just, does your yard work for you. Whatever, eases your time up and your energy so that you have time to do some things for yourself and to take care of your loved ones.
Yeah, that kind of support actually improves quality of life for the caregiver. And things like what you're talking about, putting up Christmas decorations, that may not seem like a big deal. But here's what I would suggest. Try going without it and see how it feels. It feels crappy. It feels crappy. Our rituals and our traditions and our gatherings, we learned from the pandemic, if you do without those things, we suffer. We do not thrive the same way. So I think it's important for caregivers to remember that. I think this is also good perspective for anybody who works in end-of-life care on a hospice team or as an end-of-life doula. Those little things matter to our patients and their caregivers, and it's important that we pay attention to those too. So you've talked very openly as a speaker and written about this, about the financial impacts of caregiving. And it's interesting. So it increases exponentially, hands-on live-in caregiver, and then a remote caregiver, and then an Alzheimer's caregiver. And with the increasing number of older folks that we have with the boomer generation coming, the silver tsunami, and then the increasing numbers of Alzheimer's and dementia folks. And in hospice, that is the fastest growing population diagnosis that we have had for the last 3 or 4 years is Alzheimer and dementia related diagnoses. So we know the financial impact is huge. What can you share about the financial obstacles that you encountered as a caregiver?
Yeah, I think the one factor that you left out and all those factors is caring for multiple people. And we're seeing increasing numbers of caregivers caring for multiple people. And our research indicates that, you're caring for both parents, or in my case, I was caring for both parents and a sibling.
Right.
And, at times I helped out with my niece too. And that is a huge factor in the financial aspect of it, as well as just the internal, emotions and energy and mental stamina and everything. So, financially, when you are caring for someone, caregivers spend out of pocket. I think I mentioned earlier, it's about $7,000 a year on average, 26% of their income. I spent far more than that because of the situation I was in. And keeping up multiple places and trying to figure out the most cost-effective way to do things and still be there for my sister and still be there for mom and dad. And it eats away at you. And, I think the mistake I made was I did not have a financial advisor for me. I had my parents' financial advisor, and he was great in helping me manage their money and make sure I did everything right and think of the best ways to do that. But I just started picking up the slack and building up credit card debt and thinking I can handle this, I can do this, I should be able to handle this. And then helping some other family members as well. And, and then the next thing it's just skyrocketed and there's no way you can get out. And for me, I just kept trying, and I just felt like I was running as fast as I could every day, just trying to keep my head above water. And so, I didn't think I should spend $500 or $1,000 on a financial advisor because I didn't have money to do that.
Right.
In the end, that would have probably saved me money. I did a really good job, I think, of taking care of myself in other ways. I learned how to do that during caregiving, and I compared myself to my car. My car couldn't run on empty and neither could I. And I figured out ways to fill my tank. And that was literally the system I used to take care of myself. But I didn't think about the financial aspects of that. So close to the time my dad was passing away, I was starting to get, really desperate. And after he passed, I met with several lawyers and several financial advisors, and they all said the same thing. You really don't have a choice. And that was just a horribly demoralizing experience. I felt like, God, I made it through all this, 12 years of intensive caregiving and years. And I felt like a failure because of that. And I had to come to the point of realizing that, I'm not a failure. I had done my best, and I absolutely had done my best in every way. But the system was kind of failing me and my parents and my sister because the supports weren't there and the way they should be. I think the way that credit cards are allowed to raise interest rates so high and things is not right. But the fact is that we need more community-based supports. We paid a lot of money for 24/7 care at home. And I still provided like 60 to 80 hours a week of care. When you've got people who need help during the night, it's a lot. I think the reason I decided to be open about the bankruptcy was because there are millions of caregivers who are struggling financially, but nobody talks about it.
Yeah.
I'll give speeches and talk about this and have people come up to me afterwards. I remember one woman in particular crying and saying, we went through that bankruptcy too, and I've never told anybody. And, not even her friends, because it's embarrassing. People judge, on financial matters, people judge you differently. It's just so weird. And in the end, I think it helps caregivers realize, and I really want to get the message out that, there are some financial supports available. We need more financial supports, and it's really helpful to get some type of a financial advisor.
Yeah. When you use the word bankruptcy, I think people feel that's very shameful.
Absolutely.
And there is a lot of judgment out there. And we talk a lot to caregivers about, self-care, mind, body, spirit. Where does money fall in that?
Yeah. We put it at the bottom of the list so much because, our immediate need of feeling desperate and burned out and exhausted and emotionally drained and everything, that kind of rises to the top. I moderate AARP's Facebook group. It's an AARP Family Caregivers discussion group on Facebook. And we have over 14,000 members in this group. And even in that group, mostly that's what we're talking about is that emotional drain, the venting and, trying to deal with that, the frustrations, all of it. But when I bring up money things, they're much less apt to talk as much about it, even there, where we're all caregivers and we're all going through it.
They're just not as open to sharing about that.
And there's generations and generations of family messages around that. You don't talk about money. And there's judgments. And there's, I gave an interview for the Wall Street Journal about this. I gave an interview about my bankruptcy. That was a pretty in-depth interview. And I was shocked at the comments online with the article. And everyone kept saying, don't read the comments, Amy, don't read the comments. And it was very upsetting for me. But in the end, I'm glad I did because I started replying to them. There were so many people who said, well, why didn't they just go on Medicaid? And I say, they didn't qualify for Medicaid. Not everyone qualifies for Medicaid. Dad was getting veterans benefits, and that was, better than doing Medicaid in his case. But, and so, perhaps the readership of the Wall Street Journal is just people who have a different perspective. But I actually started replying and explaining things to people. Here's what this costs. Here's the support that is available for people. And I had people respond to me and say, I didn't know that.
Exactly.
I apologize for what I said. I mean, I think some of them just assumed that I went on bankruptcy so I could inherit whatever my parents had or something like.
Oh my gosh.
My parents had money. Why would I be going in bankruptcy? My parents didn't have anything left, and my dad had Alzheimer's. So he did make some poor financial decisions towards the end before I started getting involved. And they had used up all their savings by the time I got involved. My parents planned. They had long-term care insurance. They had savings and investments and pensions and they should have been okay. But some of the choices they made were not in their best interest, and they'd used all that saving up. And B, no one predicts or fully understands how much it costs to care for somebody who has dementia. It goes on. Daddy had dementia for like 20 years. Really from the very beginning. And in the beginning, it wasn't a cost factor. He was okay. But eventually over time, so I want people to plan as much as they can. We can't see, we don't have a crystal ball. We don't know exactly how our health concerns are going to unfold, but people need to plan as much as they can. And AARP has some great resources to help you kind of think that through. We have a long-term care cost calculator on the website. We have AARP.org/caregiving, which we have lots of articles and information, and we have a free caregiving guide that helps you think all this through. But plan as much as you can. And along the way, when you're in the caregiving situation, don't leave any door unopened. Reach out there, ask for help. It's okay to ask for help, accept help, scour the ground for anything that is going to be of assistance. And you really put it together like a puzzle. The Area Agency on Aging may have a free respite program. You can get a few hours of respite. You may have to pay a paid caregiver for part of it. Maybe they're a veteran and you can get some help from the VA. There's no one answer on caregiving. There's no one silver bullet. It is a puzzle that you piece together, and we need to have more support and more resources. I really call upon people to talk to their legislators and say, this is what the reality, here's what we need. And AARP has, is really working to have caregivers raise their hands and say, I'm going to talk about this, and I'm willing to advocate because I know what this is like.
Yeah. What is it, like 55 million caregivers, unpaid caregivers across the United States?
Yeah, about 56 million, and that includes people caring for children,
right?
And about 48 million for adults. So, especially older adults. So, yeah, it's a huge contingency. And why aren't we speaking up for ourselves more? Well, partially it's because we're so exhausted.
Advocacy is exhausting.
Yeah, well, and just caregiving is exhausting.
Yes.
So have then the time to advocate for ourselves. Many times it's, if you're like me and, I always say I'm always going to be a caregiver. I have other caregiving responsibilities now that are different. My boyfriend's mom is older. I'm way down the list on the direct helping her out, but I'm part of the team in a way, and talking and advising him and stuff. There are lots of different ways of being a caregiver, but as you are a former caregiver from an intensive experience, think about how you can step up now and help other caregivers or yourself in the future, because you're probably going to be a caregiver again.
Amy, as we close, tell my listeners how they can connect with you. You've got your own website, and how they can connect in with the resources that you're working with at AARP.
Please visit aarp.org/caregiving. We have all kinds of resources. I write a column there. We have several other columnists, a lawyer, a psychologist. We have really informative, practical advice from incontinence to juggling work and caregiving. I mean, you name it, every caregiving topic. Free caregiving guides, a free financial workbook for family caregivers that's really helpful. And you can always find me on social media. I'm at Amy Goyer on pretty much every social media platform. And my website is aarp.org/Amy Goyer for my AARP content. And then my website is amygoyer.com.
I'll have links to everything in the show notes. Amy, your story, it's not just inspiring. You may not think of yourself that way, but the life lessons and the wisdom and your willingness to share it, it's such a gift. Thank you so much for talking with me today.
Well, thank you so much for having me on the show, and thank you for what you're doing to help families and help family caregivers.
We didn't even scratch the surface of everything that Amy's been and done and seen and experienced, and everything she's learned, beginning with her grandparents and then caregiving for her mom and then her dad. She said she's always had some form of caregiving role, whether it was remote or hands-on or live-in. She's done it all. She's even had a hospice experience, and that was with her dad. She realized that she didn't want to wait to include hospice in her dad's care until it was too late, which is a very common issue that we experience in the United States. People put off utilizing hospice care. Sometimes it's just a matter of a lack of education about what they can do, or it's fear, loss of hope, or denial. Just depends on the caregiver and the family and the patient. But Amy knew enough from working in caregiving roles. She spoke the language, as she said. She didn't want to wait. And she found out that the support of hospice was extremely helpful for her and for her sisters. So she's done all these different forms of caregiving: remote, live-in, hands-on, remote caregiving, and financial caregiving, which is an interesting aspect we don't talk about much. We talk about self-care for the caregiver, mind, body, spirit. We want you to be healthy. We want you to thrive. That has to include your finances. And you heard Amy talk about the impact on the finances of caregivers, which is very common. A lot of caregivers spend as much as 26% of their income. I don't know about you, but I wouldn't want to cut away a quarter of my income. So there's a lot of impact, and she's very open and honest about the bankruptcy that she experienced. One of the biggest lessons I think she really highlighted was creating that village. They could not have done it unless they pieced together this framework of caregivers and caregiving for her parents. She called it a puzzle, fitting in all those pieces so that the care was well-rounded and her parents were cared for in a way where she knew they were safe and they had quality of life. She also talked about the little things that she learned along the way, the rituals, the traditions, like something as simple as decorating for the holidays, how that was important to her. She knew it would be important to her mom, too, after her mom's stroke. And so she had this friend who worked as a concierge, and they had the Christmas decorations done. Something as small as that, but it translates into quality of life, which is what end-of-life care, what hospice care is all about. So AARP has tools to help you with caregiving, anything surrounding caregiving, financial planning for caregiving, calculating long-term care expenses, all sorts of things. You can check it out at aarp.org. And to get specifically into their caregiving resources, go to aarp.org/caregiver resource guides and check Amy's website out at amygoyer.com. You're going to find some great support, a listening ear. Check out their Facebook group as well. I'll have links in the show notes so you can go straight into it. Be sure to catch the next episode of the Heart of Hospice podcast. You can find more episodes on theheartofhospice.com. Don't forget to subscribe on your favorite podcast platform. You can connect with the Heart of Hospice on Facebook and Instagram, and send your questions or comments to me by email to helen@theheartofhospice.com. And remember, no matter who you are or where you are in your hospice journey, you are the heart of hospice.
This is the Whole Care Network. Helping you tell your story one podcast at a time.